I believe we're at about 2:30 now. Does that look right to you all?
Yep.
I will go ahead and get started then. And before I do, I'd just like to say welcome and thanks to everyone for giving us just a few moments of your afternoon to discuss Seamless Access Initiative with you. During the next 20 minutes or so, we'd like to give you an overview of this initiative, current problems with IP access, and how Seamless Access solves these and how user privacy is protected. And that should give us about 10 minutes left for question and answer, and we'll push those to the end of the presentation. Well, I think first off, we'll start with, well, what is Seamless Access? Just a quick overview, Seamless Access was created in July 2019 as a community-driven effort to enable seamless access to information resources, scholarly collaboration tools, and shared research infrastructure. To date, we have 4 founding organizations, which is NISO, which you are all familiar with, GÉANT, which is a European Research and Education Network, the Internet 2, which is sort of the American version of the same, and the International Association of STM Publishers. So, you know, in essence, think of us as the operational successor to the RA21 project. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that and familiar with that initiative, where we will be delivering an operational service along with best practices and standards. Well, why are we here? And I've had a lot of conversations with colleagues all across the nation. And, you know, I get persistent questions around, well, why do we need this? It's a good question. Isn't this a solution looking for a problem? Well, we use Easy Proxy. It only costs us, well, however much it is now, $650 if it's a local install, and it works just fine. Well, true. But consider that library use of IP recognition was developed when offsite access to e-resources was in its infancy, and it's changed remarkably little since then. You know, but after 20 years of IP authentication, there's just a lot better alternatives at our disposal. And really, if you think about it, libraries are about the only organization that still uses IP authentication. And it just, you know, today's modern users, they don't get it. Does not compute, if you'll pardon the pun. So Seamless Access has a number of important goals. Very importantly, we want to improve remote access scenarios. I think we can all agree that there's been a considerable increase in remote access to online resources over the years, and of course now from a multitude of devices as well. And also, this is sort of a usability showstopper in my opinion, but with IP authentication, we force researchers to start from, or at some point circle through the library's website to find a proxy prefixed URL. And you know, this extra friction, it just simply deters users, complicates things. And it's just not how researchers research these days. So I think an important concept concerning Seamless Access is that we are aiming for delivery of information at the point of discovery. We also want to improve usability of access. Current issues include, but certainly aren't limited to, there's currently numerous clicks to get to content behind an authentication barrier. There's numerous user credentials scattered over a multitude of platforms for our library users. And if an institution is using, you know, VPN or Shibboleth and or Easy Proxy or some hybrid therein, then the user is immediately overwhelmed with options. And the image on the right-hand side of my slide, this gives an example of what we as librarians are faced with when we need to support these different access modalities. You know, I think we can all agree that users, they don't want to have to watch how-to videos or read copious documentation just to figure out how to access a full-text journal article to which they're rightly entitled. Also, you know, to that end, access is currently so complicated for our end users that fully entitled folks are turning to alternative resources like Sci-Hub and ResearchGate. And I know that librarians certainly don't even want to implicitly suggest that that's an alternative, at least a good one, a legal one. In addition, we want to provide the capability for personalization services, which this initiative provides. And also we want to enhance user privacy mechanisms. And Tim will discuss that more at length later in our presentation. There's also security concerns and workflow issues with traditional IP authentication. I mean, there's this ongoing perception among librarians that IP authentication is more privacy preserving than federated authentication, and it's simply not. You know, IP addresses, you know, you can conflate those with usernames, and that can directly identify an individual and their location, you know, any users with a dedicated IP address. And that's already not in compliance with GDPR. And two, it seems like, you know, I've sat in a lot of library instruction sessions, and it seems like we're doing a huge disservice to our patrons if we are instructing them to create individual accounts on numerous vendors' platforms, you know, EBSCO and ProQuest and all those, as well as probably the discovery service to which we provide access to those. And just seems like we should, you know, and we force them to do that, or at least instruct them to do that so that they can get the personalization services that allow them to save articles and citations and search queries and the like. And, you know, as librarians, it just, in my opinion anyway, it just seems like we should do a better job of protecting our patrons' privacy, you know, and we were all about that back in the days of print resources, of course, but as we started the transition to online resources, it seems like the horse got out of the barn, you know, and we've done a great job in recent years of kind of reestablishing the importance of this as librarians, but there's more we can do, and Seamless Access allows us to do that. Also consider that most libraries still use some type of URL rewriting methodology like Easy Proxy, or even WAM is still out there, believe it or not. And these have numerous security vulnerabilities, just too many to mention right now. And also, this is sort of anybody that's sat in the electronic resources librarian chair, or acquisitions, or technology, anywhere really. And if a compromised user account has been identified by a vendor, they are forced to shut off access to the entire institution, or at least to a wide swath of IP numbers within that institution. And again, if you sat in that chair and the phone started ringing off the hook because ACS cut off access to their platform until you figure out what to do about this malicious user account, that's about an 11 on the stress factor. And that's no longer necessary with federated access, because we can quickly identify that one individual account and shut off access to that single account as opposed to the entire institution. Heaven help us. So that's a quick rundown about Seamless Access, but I did want to build in some time for a quick demo. Seamless Access does currently have an operational service that's currently in beta, that's currently in place. And so I can actually show you, give you a live demo of what this looks like to the user and the overall user experience. So we'll take a typical use case of a user search. I mean, they could be out anywhere on the open web, of course, but for this demo, we'll just say they started their research in Google Scholar, and they searched and located, retrieved a citation in which they would like to view the full text. So this is a Google Scholar slide. And I've got an embedded URL there that will just bounce us over to the ScienceDirect platform where the full text article resides. So notice that we're invited to access to our institution through this standard Seamless Access login button. And this is a very consistent look and feel and readily understandable to our users. And this will be consistent over a multitude of vendors' platforms. So if we click on this for the first time, then we are prompted to locate our institution, because we have to establish our affiliation, basically. And I happen to have an affiliation with Boston College. So we start typing in the name, and then it automatically gives you a list of options. We'll choose Boston College, sign in via our institution, and then we are directed over to the Boston College Shibboleth environment. We quickly sign in. And this is not part of the seamless access service. This is something that Elsevier is putting in the middle of authentication, but it's not necessary, so we'll continue. And lo and behold, now we have access to the full text article. But now notice that the seamless access, the access to your institution button that was previously available is now gone. And you can see that we have access is brought to you by Boston College. And you can also click on the little icon here, the seamless access icon, and it shows you that this access is brought to you by Boston College Libraries, who is our current affiliation. So great, that's how we get access to the full text article. So now let me jump back over to my slide, run through a couple of screens here. So we'll see that the user has finished with this particular article, and they're performing additional research now. We'll just say that they've gone back to Google Scholar. Again, it could be anywhere on the open web. And they've located a journal article that they would like to view on the ACS platform, American Chemical Society. So we are redirected to the ACS platform, that particular journal article. And if we want to notice that the invitation to establish to access through seamless access has now been changed with accesses through Boston College. Because we established our affiliation back on the Science Direct platform, now we have access to this if Boston College provides access to this particular platform. That's because the way seamless access works is it stores this affiliation or this little chunk of information in your local browser storage. So I do want to show you one other little chunk of functionality that's part of the seamless access service. Again, if we just wanted to look at the full text, we could do so, but I also want to show you this. If you look under the access through Boston College, which is part of the seamless access functionality, we can add or change our institution. In case that, we wear several different hats, we have several different affiliations or accounts with different, we have different institutional identities, basically. And, that's typically not going to be the case. Rarely is that going to be the case with an undergraduate student, but that can frequently be the case with an associated or adjunct faculty who, typically could work for several different institutions as well as a research collaborative body or whatever the case may be. So I clicked on change our affiliation, and we are now prompted again to search by university or organization. Different platform, same functionality. This time I happen to have an actual account with Coastal Carolina University. Same thing occurs. We are redirected quickly to now Coastal Carolina University's Shibboleth platform. We log in, and there's the full text. Now notice that our access is provided by Coastal Carolina University. So that, in a nutshell, is how seamless access works. So I'll tell you what, I'll hand off to Tim now, and he'll discuss how user privacy is managed within the context of federated access. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen here. Okay.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we handle and ensure user privacy in the context of seamless access. So the first point I want to make is that privacy is about balance. What you want to balance is security and accessibility. So while it's possible to configure access that's completely anonymous or access that's completely transparent, to use examples from each end of the scale, some of us opt for shades of gray. In other words, giving up some level of privacy in return for something valuable, which might be a level of personalization that makes use of a resource more efficient and more engaging. In the previous session before this one in Charleston, Lisa Hinchliffe was citing a very interesting project called Data Doubles, which I hadn't heard of before. You might want to Google it. It's researching student attitudes towards privacy. And she noted one of their findings that students are mixed in their perceptions of data privacy and security, the degree to which they trust libraries and what they assume that libraries do or don't do with their data. And she noted that having a binary approach at either end of the scale is probably not going to serve libraries well. And I couldn't agree more. You know, we all differ in our attitudes toward this, so we need a solution that gives us flexibility. How this plays out in the library world is that we each make decisions based on our institutional and library policies. It can also depend on the nature of the resources themselves. So you might have a lot of resources where access should always be anonymous, but you might also have some resources where there are valuable feature sets if people want to personalize it anonymously. And there may also be some valid reasons why personal data needs to be shared. Say a patron's doing online training and needs to have their learning personally accredited to them. So you need some flexibility really in how you approach this. So the ideal solution is one that gives libraries control over what shade of gray is appropriate to their organization and their resources. So federated authentication, which is what SeamlessAccess is sitting on top of, puts libraries in control of privacy. I'm just going to talk a little bit about why, because if you're not familiar with federated authentication, this is very different from traditional approaches like IP authentication or referring URLs. So firstly, your institution decides what data or attributes in federated speak are shared with a vendor, if any. Secondly, attribute release only happens after a user is authenticated. Nothing happens, nothing's shared otherwise. And this gives libraries really important control over access, costs, and risks. So let's dig into this in a little bit more detail. So attributes is the term used to describe data about an authenticated user. Attribute release is the process by which that data is shared by an identity provider. And as you saw in the example when John logged in, the Shibboleth server of his institution, with a service provider like the American Chemical Society. The format an attribute takes depends on the underlying technology. So security assertion markup language, or SAML, is the technology that underpins Shibboleth, which is an open source implementation of federated authentication that a lot of universities use. But there are other technologies. So for example, OpenID Connect is used for consumer-facing services like Facebook and Google. So attribute release is not required as part of federated authentication. So your institutions can simply assert, yes, this user is an authorized member of our organization and do nothing more. In that case, the identity provider, your Shibboleth server, just provides an anonymous assertion identifier that will be associated by the service provider with that authentication response. There's an example of it in the slide. It's got no personal data in this at all. It's uniquely generated for every single access attempt. So it ensures that user privacy is preserved. And you could just do that day in, day out if you wanted to. So what are some examples of attributes that can be shared? So affiliation attributes is one category. So these define the organizational association between the user and the home institution. So again, in John's examples, he might be a visiting fellow at Boston College, but he may be a lecturer or a library administrator at Coastal University. Entitlement attributes, so that confirms the user's right to access a given resource based on criteria previously agreed with a service provider. So that might be, for example, a URL or a licensing contract. Pseudonymous identifier, this is a really important one. So this can be shared. It's unique to each person and each service provider. So it masks my true identity, but this identifier is the same every time I visit a particular service provider. But if I go to a different service provider, they get a different persistent anonymous identifier for me. So think of it like swappable Halloween masks. Every time I go to ProRequest, I wear my Superman mask. They don't know who I am, but they can see me when I come back. And when I switch to ACS, I wear my Batman mask. Again, they don't know who I am, but they can recognize me when I come back. So this can be used to personalize the user's experience. And then there's personally identifiable attributes such as a name and email address. So why do we care about attributes? We care because they give you control. So you can choose, they give you access control. You can choose to make a resource available only to users who are, say, full-time staff and students, and you can not give it to, say, alumni or contractors. Cost control, so you could limit access to users from a certain department or a certain location. Risk control, and this ties back to something that John said, that pseudonymous IDs allow users to benefit from personalization without having to pass over credentials separately. So there's none of the risks or hassle of having to register yet another username and password. It's also good for service providers. Now, this is an environment where there are risks for service providers and publishers of holding this data. So they can recognize a returning pseudonymous ID, personalize that experience, but not have to receive personally identifiable data themselves, not having to store an email address, not have to ask for a password. It happens, as I said, only after the user's authenticated. And it can also be configured for different categories of publisher or service provider. And library resource access is only one of a number of different use cases for federated authentication. Other examples would be research collaborations, where you've got faculty, say, researching together with faculty from other institutions. In that situation, they might share more data about themselves, or internal institutional workflows. So, for example, a faculty member wanting to spend an APC to publish something open access. But there is a challenge the libraries face when configuring access, and that is that there are no categories that are designed for attribute release in library situation. So the way federated authentication is most efficiently managed is by grouping different types of service providers together in what's called an entity category and applying a pre-baked set of attribute release criteria. And the most well-known category in use today is called the RefEds, Research and Scholarship entity category. RefEds is the Research and Education Federations group. They represent the global research and education identity federations. And this category cannot be applied to licensed online resources. So this means that if you're a librarian, there are no standards for how organizations, your institutions, should configure and release attributes for the many use cases that fall outside of this research and scholarship category. And library access to licensed resources is a big one. So how are we solving that? So SeamlessAccess is addressing this problem by developing standards in this specific area. The goals are to set some broadly understood expectations about user privacy for federated authentication, to standardize the sets of attributes released in typical use cases, and to simplify configuration for institutions, which also means avoiding mistakes. These recommendations we've created were done with a working group which had more than 20 members from across industry stakeholders, including librarians, as well as federations and publishers. And these are the categories. So we're proposing 3 new entity categories and associated attribute bundles. The authentication only category would be used where a service provider doesn't need any user attributes, just confirmation of an organizational affiliation. Done, nothing needs to be shared. The anonymous authorization category we use where they need to filter access based on a user's affiliation. So for example, this one's only for faculty. So in that case, an attribute would be shared to give that affiliation information. And the pseudonymous authorization category is that Halloween mask I mentioned. That's to allow the experience to be personalized for a user by sharing a pseudonymous identifier, but again, no personal information. That identifier could be mixed with, say, an affiliation attribute, so they could still identify that I'm faculty, for example. One other issue that I want to briefly touch on is contract language. So it's no good having privacy policies unless they can be enforced. And one of the other areas where the industry doesn't have good standards is over the contract language that's used. And so there's a working group happening right now that's looking at contract language templates and developing templates that libraries can use that tie into these proposed entity categories. It will give you as libraries a mechanism to ensure attribute release compliance. And last slide, SeamlessAccess, as John mentioned, is storing an institutional identifier in your local browser storage. There's no personal information that we're capturing. You do not have to store that. You can opt out. You can choose not to store your local affiliation, in which case every time you see that access to your institution button, you'll just be asked to identify each time. We also are asking service providers to subscribe to a data protection code of conduct that says that they should only use attributes that are necessary for access, use as little data as possible wherever possible, not do anything but provide access with this data, and delete or anonymize the data when it's no longer needed. And this is, if anyone's interested, this is the GÉANT Data Protection Code of Conduct. It's, you can Google it, it's very readable, and it aligns quite closely with the American Library Association's privacy guidelines. That is me done. Do we have any questions at this point, Darby?
We have one question from a participant. Our students are increasingly using mobile devices to access library resources. Are there any particular challenges to seamless access in mobile environments?
There shouldn't be. It's slightly more technically complex. You have to make sure you design an interface where someone can easily do this on a much smaller screen, but the technology works just as well. So they would still be able to log in through there using the same credentials that they'd use in a normal browser. So no, that wouldn't be a problem. The one thing to bear in mind is that when your affiliation is stored, it's obviously stored on a device. So if you log in, share your affiliation in your Office desktop or your desktop at home or your laptop, and then move to another device, it would not be able to recognize your affiliation. You need to do that again. But other than that, there's no reason why that would be a problem. I've got one more thing I wanted to, if there are no questions, I just wanted to share one more slide, which was just some practical examples of how this can be used. Let's share my slides again. Here we go. Just go. Here we go. Publishing use cases. So some practical examples of how this works are the following. So if you've got a publisher where they're just sharing full text articles with no need for personalization, there's nothing to pass. There's this anonymous assertion identifier I mentioned earlier, no need for any attributes at all, absolutely privacy preserving. Say you've got an example where users can get content recommendations in the interface based on their prior history. To do that, the publisher would need to recognize them as returning. That's an example of when you could use a pseudonymous ID. Again, no privacy, personally identifiable information shared. The third one will be, say you've got a resource where faculty can purchase ebooks. They can use library funds to do it. You as the librarian don't want students necessarily doing that. So there you could use a pseudonymous ID along with an attribute for a user role. So the publisher could identify that this person is faculty and enable that feature, and this person is student and disable that feature. And again, no personally identifiable information. And the last example where it would be appropriate to share personal data, say you had a continuing education service where clinicians were logging in, they were getting training, they needed to receive an email confirmation of credits received. And in that case, you could have a pseudonymous ID with an email address, but we would absolutely recommend that user consent was sought in situations like that. And that's it. A question, how long does a session remain valid on a device? So it will stay there until you choose to clear it or you choose to change it. So say, as you saw in John's example, so he stored Boston College. If you then choose to change that, the device will store up to your 3 most recent, and then at that point, it'll start getting rid of the most oldest one. Or you can, as a user, go in at any point and delete them. So you control this. They're not stored in any central location. If you choose to delete them from your device, there's no way a publisher can have remembered what they were. You will just start being asked again. And a good example of this is in John's demo. He's obviously logged in many times. He just clears his local storage. And so when he starts the demo, it doesn't recognize who he is. So another one, what if a publisher is not SAML compliant? So a publisher would need to support federated authentication to be able to offer this, yes. And that's something that Seamless Access is actively working on. And if you look at the list of publishers who are currently compliant, it's almost all the major publishers. You've got Elsevier, you've got Springer, you've got Wiley joining, you've got the Atopon Literatum platform, you've got the Silverchair platform coming in. I think you'll find that although the smaller publishers aren't doing it initially, they will start following within the next 6 to 12 months because I think the direction the industry is going is pretty clear. The burden, it's worth noting, is less on the publisher than the library. Libraries do need to be using federated authentication in order to be able to take advantage of this. And that is a whole separate question that we could spend another seminar on entirely. I saw one more question. If a device were to be stolen, so if a device was stolen and someone was to look in the local browser storage, they could see that the person who used that device had previously logged in as this institution. But if they were going to that level, they probably got a lot more information from you on the device they've stolen. But yes, they would know that that device belonged to someone who had previously logged in as a particular institution. It is 3 o'clock now, so I think our time is over. Thank you very much for watching, listening. If you've got questions, please contact us. You can either contact John or myself directly or contact the team at SeamlessAccess. It's info@seamlessaccess.org, and there's a lot more information on the seamlessaccess.org website. And enjoy the rest of Charleston. Thank you very much, everyone.